If you're a big Type Moon fan, 2026 is going to be a crazy year for FGO because a lot of the servants next year are going to be collab characters. In other words, characters from other Type Moon works. It's not going to be actual characters from other IPs or anything like that. So even though I'm doing another annual servant tier list for the 5 stars, in the end of the day, only you really get to decide which servant you want to go to depending on what series you liked, which character resonates with you, which servant fits your playstyle, whether you see a servant as a must-have or at the other side of the spectrum, a servant that's pretty skippable. Of course, comment down below your main goal next year. Who is the servant you are looking forward to the most as far as the 5 stars go? And as usual, I will be using a rough roadmap that I found online. Link is in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to look at that roadmap yourself, especially for servants like Oberon, who is going to be coming back next year. So if you don't have him and you're not looking to guarantee that stars, then there is another chance where you could roll for him. But anyway, starting the tier list will be the New Year servant Yamato Takeru. Now I'm going to keep things simple with this tier list this year because Yamato Takeru I would say is good, but there are many alternatives. In the end of the day, he's kind of just a generic arts looper. Kind of just a side grade, if not a slight downgrade to Muramasa. But it really depends on what you're facing because he does do extra damage against divine and demonic enemies. Plus, he's unique in the sense that he does put a 50% arts resistance down on the targeted enemy, even though he is AoE. So even though he's probably not going to outperform your dedicated single target Saber or single target servant in general, he's going to do pretty good damage on a singular enemy, while also doing damage on the rest of the enemies. Which again makes him kind of unique in the sense that yes, he could farm, but perhaps in like higher level farming quests or maybe even challenges where there's multiple enemies and one main boss, he might end up out damaging a lot of other 5-star loopers out there. But in the end of the day, I would just put him at good. There are many other alternatives. Again, if you already have Muramasa, if you have Summer Ibuki, if you decide to go for Space Aresh later in the year, there are so many great arts loopers, it's insane. So if you need specifically a Saber, he's definitely not a bad choice to go for. And of course, if you already like the character or you like his design because you played Samurai Remnant, then knock yourself out, go for him. And speaking of Fate Samurai Remnant, we will also be getting the Fate Samurai Remnant collab event, which will introduce us to Avenger Minamoto no Raiko, also known as Ushi Gozen. Now right away, and this is gonna pay me to do this, I would probably put Ushi Gozen at meh, up to you, but overall skippable because like many other AoE quick servants, I feel like this is very common with quick servants for some reason, but Ushi Gozen suffers from having abysmal NP gain and abysmal damage. That, and as an Avenger who's an AoE quick servant, she has to directly compete with Edmund Dantes, who's just a million times better at this point, has had 2 buffs over the years. And in the grander scheme of things, there is another quick servant that's going to come out later in the year that just overshadows pretty much every other AoE quick servant in the game. So unless you really like Ushi Gozen, her character, or you're a fan of Hanjo Raita's art, I'd probably wait until later in the year if you're in desperate need of that AoE quick servant. Moving on from the Fate Samurai Remnant collab event, we will be going into Valentine's, which will give us Andromeda, a 5-star AoE quick rider, another AoE quick servant. As a looper, she's alright. You know, if you want to use her for general farming, especially like QP farming, then she's going to perform pretty well. But given her buffs from her skills and her NP, she's a servant that specializes in being a tank. So in a longer battle, in challenges and boss fights, she can perform pretty well as a servant that's going to tank the hits and deal damage over time. So if stalling fits your playstyle, then Andromeda is a decent pick. Otherwise, under most circumstances where players like to min turn during challenges, again, I'd probably wait until later in the year for a stronger quick servant, but otherwise Andromeda is pretty reliable. So I would probably put her also with Yamato Takeru. Not saying that there's really that many other alternatives as far as tanks go, but I wouldn't put her any higher just because like she's not like OP or anything, nor is she like a game changer or a meta-defying servant. She's pretty good, but not insanely good. Now moving on from February past Valentine's, we are going to be going into March, where we will be getting Ordeal Call 2. And our first Ordeal Call 2 servant will be Marie Antoinette Alter. And remember what I said about Ushi Gozen having to compete with Edmund Dantes? Well, Marie Antoinette is an Arts Avenger, an AoE Arts Avenger to be exact. So not only does she have to compete with 1, not 2, but 3 other 5 stars: Space Star, Summer Kama, and Nidacris Alter as far as 5-star Avengers go. Not to mention also Welfare 4-star Redmaru X, which most of us will already have at NP5. All that said, unlike Ushi Gozen, I wouldn't call Marie Antoinette a bad servant at all. She's a good looper, she has great defensive skills, great support actually, decent to great damage depending if you curse the enemies because she does extra damage against curse. So in the end of the day, she isn't a bad pick, but again, there are so many options for AoE Arts Avengers and just AoE Art Servants in general. But because I put Yamato Takeru at good, I'd probably put her at good as well. Plus it's Marie Antoinette, for God's sake. She's a fan favorite. Now, we mentioned Edmond Dantes earlier, and Ordeal Call 2 actually introduces us to another version of Edmond Dantes, the Count of Monte Cristo. And to put it simply, this Dantes is cracked. He's basically the Avenger version of normal Kama or Medusa Saber. Basically an insanely powerful single target quick servant that can stun lock the enemy. I'd even go as far as saying he's one of the most powerful single target servants in the game, period. His NP alone has built-in Ignore Invincible, which is something I value. Does extra damage against burned enemies. He has insane NP refund with his NP. And if you look at his skills, they're all very simple, but very, very effective. Great steroids, great defensive buffs. Of course, he has a 50% battery. Again, this guy's absolutely cracked. So to be honest, if you're missing a really powerful single target servant or single target quick servant, I would probably honestly put him at must-have. He's just that damn broken. Now, I can see the argument being made that he's probably just on like a tier below. He's not necessarily a must-have, because must-haves are like the Oberons of the game, the Castorias, the Koenskayas, the Scotties. And in that sense, he's not really a must-have. But because there's really nobody else in the year that's like an Oberon level servant, he's pretty much the closest you're gonna get as far as offensive servants are concerned. So capping off Ordeal Call 2 later in the month of March, maybe even early April. Again, this is not going to be an exact schedule of events for 2026, but we will be getting the Mohotsukai no Yoru, the Witch on the Holy Night collab event, which will introduce us to, of course, 5-star foreigner Aoko Aozaki. So I just glazed Dantes as one of the strongest servants of the game. I'd say in contrast, Aoko is probably one of the funnest servants in the game. Not saying she's not powerful or not strong. She's absolutely cracked if you look at her skills. A lot of crit potential, a lot of steroids. She could give 50% battery to the rest of the party, which is crazy. And similar to Kukulkan, she has a passive that transforms normal invincible to anti-enforcement defense. And her NP is generally really, really powerful, even as an AoE art servant where the competition is steep. But her biggest drawback is if you're trying to use her for min turning or farming, you have to dedicate an entire turn to setting her up. Because the first time she uses her NP, she doesn't do any damage at all, because her initial NP is supposed to set her up and transform her into Super Aoko, which completely changes her skill set and her NP. So even though her NP as Super Aoko is great for farming, great for AoE damage, she is incapable of clearing turn 1 with her NP since she hasn't transformed yet. Of course, there are a lot of ways to circumvent this, like using servants such as Habitrot and Arash to clear turn 1, but obviously this also means inherently Aoko isn't really the most consistent when it comes to farming. That said, I still stand by the fact that I call her one of the funnest servants in the game because of how unique her skill set and her NP are. I would go in depth in this video, but that would take way too long. That, and as Super Aoko, she is one of the few servants in JP at this point who can deal AoE damage with just her command cards, specifically her Buster and extra attacks, which if you're lucky, you could use those cards to clear waves, but that obviously relies on RNG to see those cards to begin with. Again, I wish I could go into more depth with her, but like I did with Van Gogh and Bazette in the past, I highly recommend Aoko purely for how unique she is. Yes, most of the game is farming, so logically speaking, it's probably better to prioritize other AoE art servants or just rely on your other options that you probably already have. But hey, it's Aoko we're talking about here, come on now. Plus, as a bonus, when you do use her NP, she changes the OST of the battle to one of the best songs from Witch on the Holy Night. That alone, I'd probably just put her at the top spot for that alone, but trying to be somewhat objective here, I'll just put her at highly recommend, because there's really nobody else that does what she does. Ironically, while Aoko has one of the most unique skill sets in the game, the second servant to come out for the Witch on the Holy Night event is Alice. And Alice, unlike Aoko, has a very, very simple skill set, and for the most part is a pretty generic quick looper, with her biggest drawback being she's a little bit on the weaker side. Now, she's not abysmally low, but she's not nearly as strong as other AoE servants out there, even though she does do extra damage against human enemies, which is a pretty common trait and attribute. But I would say her damage is pretty mid. It's not high, it's not low, it's just in the middle. But for my use, speaking personally now, I think where she excels at is at challenge quests and boss fights, because her third skill is not only a 20% battery that has a 2-turn cooldown, but it also gives her a buff that, functionally speaking, works pretty much the same as anti-enforcement defense. Granted, it's only for 1 hit and it can only be used 13 total times per battle, but again, it's a 2-turn cooldown, 20% battery, and if you've already used it 13 times and you haven't won, then she's probably not the best servant to use anyway. Plus, not only does her NP have sure hit, which is a less versatile version of ignore invincible, but I'll take it. Her NP also inflicts terror, which gives a chance of stun every turn, which could be very, very useful in boss fights and challenges. And obviously in farming, sure, hit, terror, and stun isn't really going to do anything. But again, that's why I think Alice, just like Andromeda in a lot of ways, is better equipped for challenge quests, where she could keep the enemy stunned, she could protect herself, she could spam out her NP relatively consistently. She also has a very niche passive skill that gives her a permanent, unremovable 5-use guts, which sounds broken at first, but it could only be triggered if she is instant killed. And it's niche in the sense because, at least from my experience, it's never really came into play, but I'd imagine in practice she would probably be a hard counter to like any servant that does insta kill, any assassin that does insta kill, which is a lot of them. You know, you got your Shikis, you got your Hassans. At the same time, if you're going to be using Alice as an AoE quick looper, you're probably going to be teaming her up with Scotty, and Scotty's NP already gives instant death immunity to the party. So I mean, I don't know how valuable Alice's guts is in the end of the day, but generally speaking, I'd say if you need a quick farmer, she's a good choice. She's a decent choice. But if you're all about that big damage, again, I'd wait until later in the year. Again, personally speaking, I would recommend her just because she saved my ass a number of times. So I'd probably put Alice at like the high end of good. Barely not making it highly recommend just because, again, her damage isn't the best. But I think given her utility, her loopability, her reliability, I think she deserves to be at the high end of good, if not the lower end of highly recommend. That, and as a bonus, she's voiced by Kana Hanazawa. So like, come on. One of the greatest Japanese voice actresses of all time. So that's just a bonus at that point. Moving on from the Witch on the Holy Night collab event, there's going to be around 2 months of like rerun events, pretty much dead content for a lot of players who already went through these rerun events. So April and May are going to be pretty dead for the most part. But once we reach June, we will be introduced to Hibiki and Chikagi. And I'll be honest, I didn't really recognize them. I think I recognize them from Carnival Phantasm. Otherwise, they're from a more obscure Type Moon work. So if you're a fan of them, then, you know, knock yourself out. But from a gameplay perspective, they are an AoE quick alter ego. And alter egos in general are already pretty notorious for not having the best overall damage, and Hibiki and Chikagi are no exception. And on top of that, they don't really offer anything unique or special like Andromeda with tanking or Alice with her utility. I suppose they have decent support skills, so in a multi-core team or as a backup support, I guess they could contribute. But you gotta keep in mind they are a 5-star. There are cheaper alternatives like Helena, for example, who can more or less do what they can do from a support standpoint. So I don't know if I'm underestimating them, but I personally wouldn't recommend them, especially since they have the unfortunate position of being right before anniversary and summer, which are pretty much stacked with pretty powerful servants. So I would put Hibiki and Chikagi probably all the way down here. Maybe if we're just looking at pure gameplay, maybe you could get away with putting them up here. But again, because they are right before anniversary and summer, if we're talking about like who to prioritize over the other, I would probably put them lower. Speaking of anniversary, I'm sure this servant is going to be a lot of people's main goal this year, and that's going to be our 9th anniversary servant, Space Ereshkigal, our second playable beast at this point in the game. But unlike our other beast, Draco, who's strong against the 7 main classes, Ereshkigal is sort of the reverse in that she's effective against all extra classes except for Avengers, which are actually strong against her, and she does neutral damage against the 7 main classes, including Berserkers. So simply put, she's pretty good against every class except for Avengers, essentially. Which is fine, honestly, since Avengers aren't really that common of an enemy anyway. And besides her beast class, the main gimmick around her is this Master Favorability Gauge, which is a passive buff that affects her NP damage. And again, like Aoko's kit, I'm not gonna dive that deep into it, but essentially, if you want stronger NP damage, you want to fill up her gauge, which could be increased by a variety of different things, like her bond level. The higher the bond she has, the stronger she is. If you use her skills before using her NP, if you put her in the front of your party, if you buff her with your master skills, and so on. There's a bunch of ways to increase that Master Favorability Gauge. Which, side note, I wish that was a thing with every servant, but for some reason they made it exclusive to her, so more power to them, I guess. Personally though, what I love about her, that gives her the edge when compared to other AoE art servants, is her insane 3rd skill, which grants her invincible, guts, debuff clear, buff removal resistance, and skill cooldown decrease. All those things in one skill. Now, none of them are really that useful when it comes to farming, but I'm just somebody that personally values buff removal resistance, just because that's one of the most annoying things you can run into when it comes to challenges and boss fights. Plus, no one's gonna complain about invincible and guts built into one skill as well. So even though in terms of everyday farming, Ibuki might be better, there might be better servants than Space Ereshkigal for consistent everyday farming, but given her utility, I gotta highly recommend her, man. Like, if you want to use her for farming, you could totally do that. but I think she excels also in challenges and boss fights, which if you have a servant that could do both, then how could I not recommend them? Plus in the end, it's Ereshkigal. I mean, she's a Rin face. Everyone's gonna be going for her. Right after Ereshkigal, we will be getting our summer event, of course, in which case we will have the debut of C.I.E.L. If you played Tsukihime, you should be familiar with her. Now, side note, C.I.E.L. or Archwid, who's best girl from Tsukihime? Like, comment down below who's best girl. In challenges, C.I.E.L. is very lore accurate in that she has insane survivability, with the third skill giving her 100% defense up, which functionally speaking performs similarly to Invincible or Evade, but is not affected by Invincible Pierce and rather is affected by Ignore Defense, which is a lot less common. The skill also restores her HP every time she takes damage, so even if her 100% defense up doesn't negate all the damage completely, her heals from her first skill and her third skill should circumvent that and keep her from dying. And remember what I said with Spacious Ereshkigal, how I value buff removal resistance? Well, speaking of her first skill, C.I.E.L. also has a 5-turn, again, not 3 turns, which is the usual amount, or sometimes 1 turn. C.I.E.L. has a 5-turn buff removal resistance and a 5-turn debuff resistance, both of which almost guaranteeing for 5 turns, she's not going to be screwed by buff removal or debuffs. And again, these buffs last for 5 turns, and it's a 6-turn cooldown skill. C.I.E.L. is probably going to be teamed up with Koi and Skya, who's going to help lower that cooldown. And then you could stack that debuff resistance, you can stack that buff removal resistance, and pretty much make sure she is immune to everything. And because of her survivability and utility, I've seen C.I.E.L. solo fights that I'm just like, how the hell did she solo that? And then you see it and you're like, okay, that makes sense, that checks out. Her third skill could also be used for unconventional farming teams, because her third skill does shuffle the command cards to be only her cards. So you can have fun with that by shuffling it to her cards only and then plug shooting her out for another servant, like Aoko, who we talked about earlier, who's able to do AoE damage with her command cards. Or later in the year, Phantasmoon, or later in the game, Olga, who also do AoE attacks not with their NP but with their cards. And if you have Summer BB there as well, who could lock the cards for 3 turns, then you can make some pretty fun farming teams. And obviously this could also be used in challenges as well. You could use her third skill, lock the cards to yourself, plug shooter out for somebody like Arjuna Alter, or Super Ryan, for example, where you want to see their cards for the most part to maximize their damage. So to put it simply, C.I.E.L. is an all-around powerful servant that you can throw in a variety of different situations. If you need her for soloing, great. If you need her for setting up other servants, great. If you need her for farming, great. I won't put her at must-have, but I will put her at highly recommend. I mean, you gotta put her at least there. Because again, just like Aoko, she's a very fun servant to use and experiment with. She opens the doors for a lot of different strategies out there. Capping off summer, we will be getting BB Dubai, another summer BB, and funny enough, another moon cancer. So on paper, if you just look at her skills and NP, BB Dubai is what I look for in a servant, unique and fun. In practice though, at best, she is super niche as a backup support, but not a main support by any means, and certainly not a great looper. She's niche in the sense that a lot of her buffs only apply to living human or moon cancer allies, which is not a lot of servants obviously, and there's rarely a situation where you're just going to be teaming her up with other moon cancers anyway. In my opinion, her third skill is her main draw, because you are given the option to change her NP from a AoE damaging NP to a full-on support arts NP. Again, as an AoE farmer, she's really not that good. Her damage is pretty low. As far as being a support servant, I'd say she leans better in that she protects the team, she gives debuff immune and NP strength to all allies, as well as NP gauge if you use her first skill beforehand. Very simple, very generic, but very effective buffs. But I feel like an established player doesn't really need another servant, another 5-star that provides team-wide protection, especially if you already have Castoria, if you have Merlin, Lady Avalon, even John as other options. And if you want to use her as a farming servant instead of a support servant, I mean, you got Spacer Rish, like we talked about earlier. If you already have Summer Ibuki, there's just way too many options out there. On the flip side, I can actually see a new player benefiting from a servant like her, since she can do a little bit of everything. And I could see her hard carrying a player all the way through the singularities, maybe even through the Epic Remnants as well. That, and I'm sure there are super niche team comps where she can excel at. So if you have spare quartz, maybe throw a couple rolls. Otherwise, I would probably put her at good, but there are many alternatives. Again, to put it simply, I feel like she just tries to do a little too much, to the point she's spreading herself too thin. Now granted, she's like a couple buffs away to being one of the most broken servants in the game, so maybe they didn't want to overdo it with her. Otherwise, she's completely fine. If you want to go for her, go for her. Now, moving on from Summer, we are actually going to be getting another Sakura face in the form of Kazuradrop. And just like every other AoE quick servant that we talked about beforehand, you're probably better off skipping out on her. Now granted, Kazuradrop is a pretty good looper, all things considered. She could be ran with the usual double Scotty Oberon team, triple Scotty if you want. But she could also be teamed up with herself as well, which is apparently a pretty effective way of using her for farming, just double Kazuradrop. She also has the unique ability of changing her class to whatever you are targeting at the time. So if you're targeting a Berserker, she transforms herself from Alter Ego to Berserker. If you're fighting a Saber, she transforms it to Saber, so on and so forth. Obviously, in most situations, you probably don't want to do that because then you're just going to end up doing neutral damage. Unless you're facing a foreigner, in which case foreigners are strong against other foreigners, so you could do that. Or if you're facing a multi-class wave, maybe just copy the Berserker and then you're going to be able to do extra damage against everything else. I guess that could be good. But otherwise, again, she's only going to be hitting neutral damage, which already further hinders her already okay damage as an Alter Ego. And really, there's not that much else to say about her. Besides her third skill changing class, she's really one of the more simple servants of the year. So it's really up to you if you want her or not. So I would put her probably at this tier. I feel like I'm putting a lot of servants at this tier, but I wouldn't say she's as bad as Ushi Gozen, for example, but she's, I would say, in the lower end of the good tier. And then moving on from Kazuradrop, we are going to be going into October, where we are going to be getting 5-star archer King Tut. And King Tut is unique in the sense he is the first SSR to sacrifice themselves and functions similarly to Summer Chloe in a weird way, in that you could use his first skill to support the team and then use his NP to pretty much tag him out. But unlike Summer Chloe, he actually kills himself. He doesn't just tag out. Of course, you have the option of keeping him alive with his third skill, which gives him guts. So when you use his NP and he kills himself, his guts could trigger and then keep him in the battle a little bit longer. But that really depends on the situation and what exactly your strategy is. In my opinion, as a support, he's essentially a more expensive, worse version of Chloe. And I guess in a way, a worse version of Miss Crane. You would think with an NP that ends his life, he would maybe do like an insane amount of damage or maybe have insane buffs to the rest of the party or something. But if you look at his skills and his buffs and his NP effects, there's really not anything to write home about. I hesitate to say he's probably the worst SSR in the year, but he probably is the worst SSR in the year. And I really like his design. I really like his character. But practically speaking, he's just not that great. So I'd probably put him at the lowest tier, which hurts me to do because I really like his design. I will say if he eventually gets a buff or two where his second or his third skill or both of those skills applied to the rest of the party just like his first skill, then okay, he'd be tempting. He'd be a really good servant actually. But alas, I suppose if you don't have Chloe or Miss Crane, he is a decent alternative, granted more expensive, for a lot less payoff. Otherwise, he's an easy skip in my opinion. Who's not an easy skip is going to be our next servant, Louhi. Now throughout this video, I was talking about quick loopers and like waiting until later in the year for a really good quick looper, arguably one of the strongest quick loopers in the entire game, if not the strongest looper in the entire game as far as quick SSRs are concerned. Because to put it as simple as possible, Louhi is basically Summer Ibuki but quick, in that she could consistently spam her NP. Her damage is insane. And if you remember what I said earlier with Ushi Gozen, a lot of quick loopers struggle with NP gain or NP refund, and they struggle with damage. The thing with Louhi's NP is, not only does her NP give 20% NP gain for 3 turns, but it also gives her a 3-turn NP damage up as well, 30%. So by turn 3, she's gonna have 60% NP gain and 90% NP damage. And that's not even counting like Black Grail or other buffs you might get from like Oberon, for example. So unlike a lot of quick servants, Louhi can rival Arts and Buster easily, if not even surpass a lot of them. On top of that, she has an 80% NP battery. Not the usual 50%, no, 80%. Allowing her to access her NP right away if you unlock her second append. And really, if you look at her skills, she's a very simple servant. But sometimes simple is good. And in this case, in Louhi's case, simple is broken. And I feel like in every other situation, I would confidently put her at must-have just because of how good she is. But if you've watched my tier list videos in the past, I typically put non-limited servants all the way in the bottom just because they have a chance of spooking you. And if I didn't say it already, Louhi is non-limited, so she could spook you at any given point. I believe I've been spooked by her as well. So in an alternate universe, I would probably put her down here. But because of how powerful she actually is, despite being a non-limited servant, I'm going to put her at the high end of highly recommend. I hesitate to put her at must-have just because she is non-limited, so I'll put her 1 tier down and put her at highly recommend. Now, if you are in desperate need of a quick looper, she's your end-all be-all pretty much. And then capping off the year, we will be ending with 5-star pretender Phantasmoon. Totally not arc-wit at all. As far as pretenders go, she doesn't have any direct competition since the pool of servants are really small in that class, with the only other single target pretender at the time being Hephaestion. And I guess Phantasmoon can be used similarly to Hephaestion, albeit Buster with more support skills and buffs for the rest of the party, namely her first skill being a battery and NP strength up and overcharge for the entire party, which are all pretty good buffs buffs built into one skill. That and Phantasmoon's extra attack does AoE damage, with both her third skill and her NP buffing her extra card effectiveness, which is pretty unique. Ironically enough, this also makes her pretty compatible with C.I.E.L, her arch nemesis, and Summer BB with C.I.E.L locking the cards to herself, plug suiting out into Phantasmoon, and then using Summer BB to lock the cards for 3 turns. So she's pretty straightforward for the most part, clearly meant for multi-core farming, since she could clear waves with extra attacks and crits, and given her various steroids, she can definitely contribute to challenge quests as well, with her only weakness being she lacks any form of inherent protection, and of course being a pretender limits her overall effectiveness. If only extra attacks could do crit damage, then she would be crazy. But as of right now, I would say Phantasmoon is probably at the high end of the good tier, but I suppose she's unique enough that I will put her at the low end of highly recommend. You could probably get away with like good tier, but I kind of want to put her at highly recommend. I mean, C.I.E.L is there. If I put her any lower, she might beat my ass. So I'll put her at the same tier at the very least. So looking at my tier list overall for the year 2026, again, very subjective, very dependent on the individual playstyle, but just as a little recap, Ushi, Gozen, Hibiki, and Chikagi, and Tut are all the way in the bottom because I find them to be the most underwhelming, and you would only be going for them if you really like them as characters. And then the good tier with Alice, Yamato, Takeru, Andromeda, Marie Antoinette, BB Dubai, and Kazuradrop, I think they're all perfectly fine servants. You could make the argument with some of them. For example, Alice could probably be up here, maybe Kazuradrop, depending on the situation, maybe BB Dubai if you're a new player, for example. But I think generally speaking, I think these are all perfectly fine servants. Not broken, not highly recommend, certainly not a must-have, unless you really like them as a character, like I said with pretty much every other servant. And then the highly recommend tier, of course, Louhi being the best quick looper probably ever of all time. Aoko just being very fun, not necessarily the best at any given situation, but a very fun servant. Same thing could be said about C.I.E.L. I guess the same thing could also be said about Phantasmoon, and of course Space Arrest just being an all-around great AoE arts servant. And then of course you have Dantes, who is just absolutely cracked. If I didn't have the must-have tier, I think he fits better for the highly recommend, but just because I want to stay consistent with my tier list over the years, I think comparatively speaking from the rest of the servants in 2026, I think he's definitely a must-have. Now again, you can make the argument for Louhi, but because she is non-limited, I would lower her priority just a little bit. So that's my tier list. Like the video if you like it, dislike it if you dislike it, and comment down below who is the main goal you're going to be going for next year, and comment down below what you think about my tier list. Again, very subjective. I know everyone's going to have different opinions about who should go where and whatnot, but this is how I would prioritize them from almost a purely gameplay perspective. If this was a character tier list, I would obviously put Alice on the top, I'd put Aoko on the top, and a bunch of other servants on the top. But again, I want to keep it as gameplay focused as possible. And don't forget, don't be an NPC, subscribe to me, the MC. Happy New Year's, good luck in your roles, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.